Another of the theory-guided objective tests is the Holland Occupational Themes, or RISEC. So John Holland has, according to him and his theory, there were 6 personality traits, and this is a personality theory that is very closely tied to vocational psychology. So basically, the psychology of determining what careers would make sense for people. So he was less concerned with coming up with differences between extroversion and introversion, or conscientiousness or agreeableness, as more of actually personality types as they related to actually vocation and working. So his 6 personality types included realist, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. And the idea is that each one of us varies on either being very low to very high on each of these traits. So, for instance, I am an RIA. I'm realistic, I'm investigative, and I'm artistic. So, that is a pattern of behaviors based on this. I'm fairly low on conventional, enterprising, and social. So, someone that was, for example, very high on social is very much focused on social interaction, working with groups, working with people, and some suggestions of careers that would be good for that person would be health, education, health promotion specialist. Someone that was very, very high on investigative but low on the others would be someone that would be very good in sciences and doing research. But it's also a package. So, for example, social plus investigative would be maybe someone that would be a really good science educator. But investigative plus realistic, very practical and wanting to get things done, would maybe be a very good actual practitioner of the sciences. Someone that is artistic and investigative might be a better researcher in the sciences. So each one of these basically is determined through a self-directed search test. So it's again a direct measure of personality as you're answering questions in a questionnaire to determine what your actual ratings on these 6 personality types are. Another measure is, again, we talked about the 16 personality factor, the 16PF of Cattell. Again, it is a self-report measure, forced choice, 105 to 187 items, depending which version you're taking. But each of these questions are being loaded onto one of 16 traits. So, for example, one of the questions might be, I make decisions based on feelings and reason, or reason alone. But each of these items are providing information about one of these 16 traits. So we have an example here of someone's 16PF. The first trait, distance versus aloof, they're fairly straight up. Low intelligence versus high intelligence. This is basically how much you like to learn information, how much you like to think. This is fairly high. Notice fairly low on suspiciousness. So towards the middle, we have trusting versus suspicious. And again, this pattern of behaviors is providing us a profile of that person's personality, which could then be looked at. So, for example, looking at this personality, we would notice this person is very socially bold, very dominant, but also extremely trusting. So this is someone that tends to be the life of a party, tends to be very open, very much making new friends, but also has a tendency to immediately start to trust those people very quickly and very willingly. Another example of these various personality theories, and again, we're just looking at the factor analytic inventories. Basically, what we're looking at are multiple factor personality measures. So we looked at Holland's RISEC scale. We just looked at Cattell's 16PF. Another one is Comley's personality scales, and according to Comley, we have 8 dimensions that need to be measured to really get a personality. Trust, orderliness, social conformity, activity, emotional stability, extroversion, masculinity, and empathy. Now notice some of these are similar to the big 5. So orderliness, that's conscientiousness. Activity, that is kind of openness to a new experience. Emotional stability is straight from neuroticism. Extroversion, but we also have some additional concepts. So this idea that trust is an important measure. So how much you trust someone. No, notice that also agreeableness is not necessarily in there. Instead, we have social conformity and empathy. So we have 2 subversions of agreeableness from the big 5. We also have masculinity. So this is kind of a measure of masculinity versus femininity, but most of the measures when we're looking at this is not necessarily measuring how manly are you. It's more of measuring agency, or basically being directive and taking charge, versus communality, being more focused on making people happy and conforming to the group. Comrie's personality scales are also noteworthy because they actually include a measure of validity and response bias. So we were talking earlier about the idea of validity scales in personality testing. Comrie's personality scales is a good example that there are multiple items that are in the test simply to determine, are you responding honestly, or are you showing a pattern of attempting to deceive or not to take the test seriously. We talked about briefly in the history Eysenck's personality questionnaire, and I mentioned that Eysenck had two broad categories of personality, basically neuroticism, stable versus unstable, and extroversion versus introversion. But broadly within those, he basically created a two by two table where, depending on how stable or unstable and how extroverted or introverted, you fall into a large group of clusters. So basically, he assumed that based on these two traits, we have four broad clusters of personality types. So melancholic is unstable and introverted. So that's someone that's quiet, pessimistic, sober, moody. We also have extroverted and stable. So that's sanguine, leadership, carefree, easygoing, talkative, outgoing, sociable. He has two different versions of his test. It's 90 items for both cases, and it's a bunch of statements whether, and you simply agree yes or no. I would like to do this, or I wouldn't like to do this. There are two forms, one for children and one for adults, and it measures major dimensions of normal behavior. And basically, there are three subdivisions in this. Psychoticism, so do you take risks for fun? Extroversion, do you like to meet people? And neuroticism. There's also a lie scale to detect dishonesty. So the psychoticism is basically a risk index, and it's not included in the model of determining. So someone, for example, that's melancholic could also be a very low risk taking melancholic person or a very high risk taking melancholic. So basically, the psychoticism third dimension would almost make this a three-dimensional model of within each one of these clusters of stable versus unstable, extroverted versus introverted, you also have high risk versus low risk. And again, the scale includes measures of people trying to cheat the test, because this is again a self-report test. Another common measure of personality is the NEO Personality Inventory Revised, or the NEO PIR. It's based on the five-factor model of personality, and NEO specifically comes from neuroticism, extroversion, and openness. Within the NEO, there's actually 6 facets within each factor. So it's a big 5 model, but there's also subdimensions of each one of these factors. So for neuroticism, there's going to be 6 additional facets or subcategories of neuroticism. So we're going to get an overall score on neuroticism, how emotionally stable or unstable you are, but we're also going to get information about where that neuroticism is coming from. Again, this is a 240 item test. There's 3 checks for validity. So there are items in there trying to make sure that you're taking the scale purposely, or not trying to deceive, not trying to be deceptive, and also paying attention to the scale as you're taking it. And these are items on a Likert scale. So you're being asked basically for each particular behavior or personality trait, how much is that item like or dislike you? There's 2 forms, a self-report and another report. So people can either take the NeoPi and self-report their personality, but you can also give the NeoPi to people that are going to rate someone else to have an other report. There are short versions. For example, there's the NEO 5-factor inventory with less items that you can take it a little bit more quickly. But the 5-factor theory, generally speaking, is the idea, and the 5-factor theory is primarily driven by statistical analysis of all these other personality tests. And what we find is that when you put on these hundreds and hundreds of items that are meant to measure differences in personality between individuals, they generally break into 5 broad, statistically different packages: neuroticism, openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and extroversion. And for each one of these, there's multiple dimensions of the factor. There's basically information. So the top of each one of these kind of gives you an idea of what someone would be like with a low or high score. So someone that has a low score in openness, the green bubble, is pretty practical, pretty concrete. They like things to be the same. They don't like change much. And they tend to focus on practical applications in the real world setting. Someone that's very high in openness to new experiences is very imaginative, very metaphysical, very open to flights of fantasy, but also very open to new experiences. Relevant situations is how they deal with words and ideas, and the brain mechanism is mental associations, how they actually associate things in a cognitive way. So again, neuroticism by comparison has different factors. So someone that is low in neuroticism, in other words, they're very emotionally stable, basically are unflappable. They're going to be very calm in almost any situation. Someone high in neuroticism is going to be very anxious, very easily stressed. Generally, the situation we're going to find neuroticism being a major important player in is in potential threats or danger. So basically, when you're under stress, when you're in a situation of danger, that's when neuroticism is going to be pretty predictive of behavior. And again, there's some brain mechanisms involved. So with neuroticism, the amygdala and serotonin levels affect neuroticism. So personality often is affected by physical traits. So if we look at each one of these, what we're seeing in each case is the top is telling us basically what low scores versus high scores are. The blue is telling us when these personality traits are going to be a better predictor of behavior. So what situations are more likely to find differences in people based on their personality. And finally, the light tan area is kind of giving us general information about possible physiological or brain structure differences. So conscientiousness, neuroticism, and extroversion actually are pretty tightly affected by the chemistry and the physical structure of the brain. Openness into agreeableness, a little bit less so. There's not much research that says that they're directly tied to physical structure or chemical levels in the brain. However, they are definitely affected by cognitive framing or how we think about the world around us. Another type of personality test, and one that kind of tries to get around the problem with self report. So remember that when we're using a self report measure of personality, it's pretty clear what the questions are meant to measure. And if someone wanted to, they could definitely make an attempt to present themselves as having a personality that is not necessarily completely truthful. One of the ways around this is the idea of criterion keyed objective tests. So the idea here is generally you want to either discriminate between normal and abnormal. So the very first criterion based test was basically just coming up with hundreds of questions, thousands of questions sometimes. And these questions aren't necessarily even directly related to personality. But the idea is that you would then give these thousands of questions to people that are not suffering from any kind of psychological problems, so quote unquote normal. And then you give them also to people that are known to have a psychological disability or a dysfunction, so abnormal behaviors. And then you basically look to see if there's any particular items that differentiate between the two groups. So this is the idea. The criterion here is whether you're in the normal group or the abnormal group. The keying is finding which questions differentiate between these two groups. The most famous of the criterion keyed objective tests is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It was developed in the 1940s as a psychiatric diagnosis by Hathaway and McKinley. And its final version has 567 true or false self report items. The original was well used, but was found to have a fair amount of bias. A revision came out in 1989, which has been further validated. It has 4 validity scales and 10 clinical scales, and many supplementary scales. So the validity scales are basically, is someone just giving random responses? Is someone trying to cheat the scale? The 10 clinical scales are about particular clusters of items that have been found to predict particular problems with personality. Now, again, though the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, was originally designed to identify abnormal or problematic behaviors in personality, it also provides a fair amount of information on those clinical scales of just general personality profiles. So the MMPI then, so based on these questions, for example, the various 10 scales include hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviation, masculinity versus femininity, paranoia, psychothymia, schizophrenia, hypomania, and social introversion. So notice some of these are resembling the big 5. We've got social introversion, we've got masculinity, femininity from the Eysenck scales, and also from the some of the other scales we talked about. But each one of these was then keyed, and basically, for example, the first one is patients who show exaggerated concerns about their physical health. So, which questions out of the MMPI do people disagree with when they're normal or found not to be having psychological dysfunction? And which of those questions then are responded to positively by patients that have already been diagnosed with this? So this again is the idea of criterion keying. We're finding groups. Now the MMPI can also be used, and criterion keying can also be used for non-clinical settings. So for instance, we could actually use the same technique of using criterion keying to basically identify a vocational test where we find items that people that are successful doctors agree on and people that are not successful doctors disagree on. Then we could give that test to people, and if they agreed with all those items, we could say, you probably have a personality profile that would be highly aligned with being a successful doctor. Another criterion keyed objective test is the Millian Clinical Multi-Axel Inventory. Same purpose as the MMPI, but it's shorter, 175 true-false self-report items. Again, it has 27 scales and subtests. It measures personality in general, but also severe pathology, clinical and severe syndromes, and also has some validity measures. Organized to find patterns that are comparable with the DSM. So the main reason why the Millian Clinical Multi-Axel Inventory, the MCMI, is sometimes used over the MMPI is that it's more in line with current psychiatric diagnosis, and it isn't looking just for pathology, it's also looking for general personality. There's also a criterion keyed objective test for kids, the Personality Inventory for Children, the PIC2, created in the 1950s, normed for children ages 5 to 19, has 275, there is a short form with 96, true and false other reports. So this is completed by a parent to again look for possible problems in a child's behavior. It provides a personality inventory for youth. There is a self-report version. There's also a student behavior survey that's a teacher report. So basically, we have information coming in from the parents, from the youth themselves, self-report, and also from teachers. And then based on the three of these, a personality profile is provided. But again, this has been criterion keyed. So basically, children that have been suffering with various developmental problems or behavioral problems in youth, they looked at what questions did parents endorse most that had those children, which of those children that were having these problems, how often did they self-report various items, and those are the items that were then chosen for the final measure. Some examples of these questions: my child is a finicky eater, yes or no? Sometimes my child swears to other adults, yes or no? My child finds it difficult to fall asleep, yes or no? Any one of these questions is not necessarily going to indicate a psychological problem, but if a cluster of these are all agreed on by multiple sources, the person themselves, the child, the parents, the teacher, that would be a stronger indication that there might indeed be a problem.